The red ink was still wet on the menu when Nina Calvert realized she'd just written her own death sentence or salvation. She wouldn't know which, until the man at table 7 looked down and read 3 lines that could end her life before midnight. Burlington's coldest November in 2 decades had frozen Lake Champlain into a sheet of black glass, but inside La Casa di Mare, candles flickered against mahogany walls, while the scent of basil and roasted garlic wrapped around conversations spoken in careful whispers that never rose above the piano's melancholy drift. Dario Ventrell had arrived at 8:15, exactly as he did every third Thursday, his charcoal suit fitting him like armor tailored by hands that understood the difference between fashion and function. He moved through the entrance with the kind of stillness that made noise seem vulgar, his presence shifting the restaurant's atmosphere the way a storm changes air pressure before the first drop falls. Nina had served him twice before, learning quickly that men like him preferred efficiency over charm, silence over small talk. His orders were simple, his tips generous, his eyes the color of smoke over water, present but impossible to read. She'd memorized the way he held his wine glass, fingers positioned precisely an inch below the rim, never gripping, always controlling. Tonight felt different from the moment she approached his table with the evening's specials printed on cream cardstock. The usual background noise, the soft clink of silverware, the muted laughter from the corner booth, the whisper of fabric as the sommelier moved between tables, all of it seemed muffled, as though the restaurant itself was holding its breath. She'd noticed the second man 3 minutes after Dario's arrival, watching him appear from the hallway that led to the restrooms, his movements too calculated for someone simply returning to his seat. His jacket hung wrong on his frame, weighted on the right side, in a way that made her throat tighten with recognition she didn't want to possess. The fabric pulled unnaturally, creating a bulge that professional tailoring should have concealed, but desperation had exposed. The stranger had chosen table 12, positioned with surgical precision 2 rows behind Dario's usual spot near the window, where lake lights played across the glass like scattered diamonds. He'd ordered nothing but water, declined the menu twice, and kept his hands below the table in a posture that suggested waiting rather than dining. His jaw worked constantly, grinding tension into the air around him like smoke from a hidden fire. Nina's pulse hammered against her wrists as she refilled Dario's wine, her reflection visible in the window behind him, and beyond that, the stranger's face, angular, tense, with eyes that tracked every movement Dario made. The recognition came not from memory, but from instinct, the kind that lives in the spine before the brain can name it. She'd grown up in households where survival meant reading the temperature of a room before entering it, where silence taught more than words ever could. Her father had worked loading docks, her mother cleaned houses for families who never learned her name, and both had taught Nina that people with real power never needed to announce it. Dario represented something she'd understood from a distance, but never touched directly, the architecture of control that existed beneath Burlington's polished surface. Decisions were made in expensive restaurants, and consequences arrived without warning in this world she served but didn't belong to. She'd taken this job knowing the clientele, knowing that certain tables required blindness as much as service, knowing that curiosity was a luxury waitresses couldn't afford. But the man at table 12 wasn't here for dinner, and the weight pulling his jacket down wasn't a phone or wallet. Nina's hands remained steady as she set the wine bottle on the stand, her training overriding the adrenaline that screamed through her nervous system like electricity through copper wire. The piano player transitioned into something slower, darker, the melody wrapping around the moment like smoke around glass. Other diners laughed at nearby tables, oblivious to the silent theater unfolding in their midst, their innocence a luxury Nina had never been able to afford. She could walk away, pretend she'd seen nothing, let whatever was going to happen unfold without her fingerprints on the outcome. That was the smart choice, the safe choice, the one that kept waitresses alive in cities where asking questions got you disappeared into the lake's frozen depths. When Dario requested the menu again, an unusual break in his pattern that sent alarm bells through her awareness, she retrieved it from the host stand, her fingers finding the red pen she used for marking reservation times. The walk back to his table stretched impossibly long, each step a negotiation between action and paralysis. Every instinct she'd honed over 21 years of reading dangerous rooms told her to stay invisible, to serve and retreat, to protect herself first. But something deeper than instinct had awakened, a recognition that silence could be complicity, that watching a man die without warning was a weight she couldn't carry. Her hand trembled as she gripped the menu, the cream cardstock suddenly feeling heavy as stone in her palm. She angled her body to block the view from table 12, her movements casual enough to seem like ordinary service, deliberate enough to hide what came next. The pen touched paper, 3 sentences flowing in script small enough to hide in the margin's shadow where printed text met white space. Her handwriting remained steady despite the tremor threatening to shake through her bones, each letter a tiny act of rebellion against every survival lesson she'd ever learned. She placed the menu in front of Dario, with the same neutrality she'd use for any guest, her face a mask of professional courtesy that revealed nothing of the way her heart was trying to break through her ribcage. His eyes dropped to the cardstock, scanning the entrees with the same measured attention he gave everything. Then his gaze shifted, so briefly she almost missed it, to the bottom corner where red ink caught candlelight like a warning flare in the dark. The moment stretched thin as wire, every sound in the restaurant suddenly amplified. The clink of a fork against porcelain, the whisper of someone's breathing, the distant hum of kitchen exhaust fans. Dario's expression didn't change, not in any way another observer would notice. But Nina had learned to read the microscopic shifts that powerful men tried to hide. The slight dilation of his pupils, the minimal tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his breathing slowed into something more deliberate than rest. He closed the menu with hands that moved like water, smooth and inevitable, then looked up at her with eyes that held questions he would never voice in public. His face remained a study in control, but something had shifted beneath the surface, a recalibration happening behind smoke-colored irises. His voice, when it came, carried the texture of expensive whiskey poured over old stone, quiet enough that only Nina could hear. "That'll be enough for tonight." The words were simple, unremarkable to anyone listening, but weighted with meaning that pressed against her chest like a physical force. She nodded once, collecting the menu with fingers that didn't shake, though everything inside her wanted to run or scream or do anything except maintain this facade of normalcy. Behind them, at table 12, the stranger's hand emerged from beneath the table, empty but tense, his entire body coiled like a spring compressed past its tolerance. His eyes narrowed as Dario reached for his wine glass, taking one final sip with the calm of someone who hadn't just read a death warning written in red. The crystal caught light as he set it down, creating small rainbows across the white tablecloth that seemed obscene in their beauty. The moment Dario stood, the restaurant's energy shifted like a curtain dropping between acts, and Nina understood she'd just stepped onto a stage where exits were illusions. Every gesture from this point forward would carry consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating patterns she couldn't predict or control. She stepped back from the table, giving him space to rise, her body moving on autopilot while her mind catalogued every detail. The way he buttoned his jacket with methodical precision, the angle of his shoulders as he prepared to leave, the absolute absence of fear in his movements. At table 12, the stranger's face had drained of color, as realization dawned that something had shifted in the equation he'd calculated so carefully. His right hand drifted back toward his lap, toward whatever waited there in leather or metal, his breathing shallow and rapid against the measured calm of Dario's presence. The distance between the tables seemed to shrink and expand simultaneously, space becoming elastic under the weight of intention and warning. Nina held her breath without meaning to, her lungs frozen in anticipation of the violence that might still erupt despite her intervention. Dario moved with the unhurried grace of someone who'd never needed to rush toward anything or run from anyone, his hand reaching inside his suit jacket in a gesture that could mean wallet or weapon. He extracted a billfold made of leather so soft it seemed to absorb light, laying cash on the table in denominations that would cover his meal 3 times over. The bills sat there like a period at the end of a sentence, final and absolute, while the candle between them continued its steady flame. Nina watched him turn not toward the main entrance where most guests departed, but toward the narrow hallway that led past the kitchen to the service exit. The route took him within 6 feet of table 12, close enough that she could see the stranger's pupils contract, his breathing become visible in the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Their eyes met for less than a second, but in that brief connection, entire conversations happened in the language of men who understood violence as currency. Then Dario was past, disappearing into the hallway's shadows, while the piano continued its melancholy progression through songs about love and loss. The stranger remained paralyzed for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, his hand still beneath the table, his body rigid with the tension of decisions collapsing in real time. Whatever instructions he'd received, whatever plan he'd constructed, all of it had just crumbled like sandcastles against an incoming tide. Nina stood beside the empty table, where Dario's wineglass still held the ghost of his last sip, the cash fanned across white linen like cards in a game she didn't know she'd been playing. The door to the service exit opened and closed, bringing a gust of November cold that made the candles dance and flicker, their shadows stretching across walls like reaching fingers. The sound of the latch clicking shut was the loudest thing Nina had heard all night, final as a gunshot that never came. At table 12, the stranger's hand finally emerged empty, his face a canvas of confusion and calculation, as he tried to understand how his certainty had dissolved. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward with enough force to draw glances from nearby diners, his composure shattering like glass under pressure too great to contain. His exit through the main entrance was clumsy, desperate. Nothing like the predatory patience he'd worn earlier when death was still a possibility he controlled. The other guests returned to their meals quickly, writing off the disturbance as rudeness rather than recognizing it as the death rattle of a failed execution. Nina moved on autopilot, clearing Dario's table with hands that had remembered their function, even while her mind was still catching up to what had just happened. The cash went into her apron, the wineglass onto her tray. The menu, that menu with its damning red ink, folded carefully and tucked against her hip where it burned like a brand. The weight of what she'd done settled over her shoulders like a coat made of lead, heavy and inescapable, and warming in ways she didn't want to examine. She'd saved a man's life tonight, or possibly only delayed his death, and in doing so had written herself into a story that didn't have clear endings or happy resolutions. The piano player shifted into something lighter, a jazz standard about autumn leaves and changing seasons, completely unaware that he'd been providing soundtrack to an execution that never happened. The other staff moved through their choreographed service, pouring wine and clearing plates, existing in a version of the evening that didn't include the violence that had almost bloomed between tables 7 and 12. She carried the tray toward the kitchen, her legs moving through muscle memory, while her thoughts spun in circles trying to calculate the cost of 3 sentences. Outside, through the window, Lake Champlain stretched black and endless beneath a sky scattered with stars that looked like ice chips scattered across velvet. The cold pressed against the glass like something alive and patient, waiting for her shift to end and the false safety of the restaurant to dissolve. She pushed through the kitchen doors into heat and noise and the familiar chaos of Friday service, but even there, surrounded by the crash of pans and the shouts of line cooks, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just opened a door she didn't know how to close. The menu in her apron pocket felt heavier than paper should, the red ink seeming to pulse against her hip like a second heartbeat. She'd crossed a line tonight that separated observers from participants, witnesses from accomplices, and the distance back to invisibility suddenly seemed impossible to measure. Her reflection caught in the stainless steel of the prep station, pale skin, dark hair escaping from its tie, eyes that looked older than they had when her shift started. Nina Calvert, 21 years old, who'd just saved or doomed herself with 3 lines written in red while a piano played, and a lake froze, and a man walked out into November darkness carrying the weight of a warning he'd never asked for, but somehow needed. The restaurant closed at 11, but Nina's hands were still shaking at 11:30 when she finally untied her apron in the staff room. The other servers had left quickly, eager to escape into their Friday nights, their conversations about weekend plans and breakfast shifts fading into the parking lot's darkness. She'd folded the menu carefully and placed it in her locker, unable to throw it away but terrified to keep it, the red ink seeming to glow even in the dim fluorescent light. The cash from Dario's table sat in her pocket, $200 for a meal that cost $60, the excess feeling less like a tip and more like payment for services she hadn't known she was providing. The kitchen had gone quiet, only the dishwasher's final cycle humming through the walls while the chef counted inventory in the walk-in cooler. Nina pulled on her coat, an old wool thing that had belonged to her mother, its warmth insufficient against the kind of cold that came from inside rather than out. She stepped into the main dining room to collect her things from behind the host stand, and that's when she saw it. An envelope sat on the polished wood surface, cream-colored and expensive, positioned exactly where she'd have to see it when leaving through the front entrance. No name marked the outside, no address or stamp, just the paper itself catching the security lights that stayed on after closing. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached, each step feeling like walking toward a cliff edge in darkness, knowing the drop was there, but unable to see how far down it went. The envelope was sealed, the flap tucked with precision that suggested careful hands and deliberate intention rather than casual correspondence. She picked it up, surprised by its weight, not heavy exactly, but substantial enough to know something more than paper lived inside. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the sound impossibly loud in the empty restaurant where chairs sat upturned on tables like sleeping animals. Inside, a single sheet of paper folded once, the texture suggesting quality that most people never touched, the kind of stationery that came from stores Nina had never entered. She unfolded it beneath the security light, and there, in handwriting that looked like it had been pressed into the paper with fountain pen rather than ballpoint, a single letter sat centered at the top. The L was elaborate without being ornate, confident without being showy, the kind of mark someone left when they knew their initial carried weight. Below it, 4 lines in the same careful script, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood that economy of language was its own kind of power. You saw what no one else did. That carries value beyond currency. Keep the silence. Stay careful. No signature. No further explanation. Just those sentences that felt more like a contract than a thank you note. Nina read them 3 times, her eyes tracking over words that seemed simple on the surface, but carried depths she was only beginning to understand. The paper trembled in her hands as the implications settled into her bones like cold water seeping through cracks. She hadn't just saved Dario's life. She denounced herself as someone who saw things, who acted on instinct, who possessed awareness that most people in her position were supposed to suppress. That made her valuable, which in the world she'd just touched meant she was also vulnerable, a paradox wrapped in expensive stationery and delivered in darkness. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her coat pocket beside the excessive cash, both items feeling like evidence of a crime she hadn't meant to commit. The walk to the front door felt longer than it should, her footsteps echoing against tile and wood in rhythms that sounded like warnings. She locked up using the key the manager had given her months ago, the routine of checking the bolt 3 times, suddenly feeling like superstition rather than responsibility. Outside, November hit her face like a slap, the cold so sharp it burned going into her lungs. Lake Champlain stretched beyond the parking lot, invisible in the darkness, but present in the way the air tasted of ice and deep water. Her car sat alone under a street lamp, its old Honda frame looking fragile against the night pressing in from all sides. She'd bought it with savings from 2 years of double shifts, its reliability more important than its appearance, its anonymity a feature she'd never appreciated until tonight. The drive home took her through streets she knew by heart, past the university campus where students her age worried about exams and relationships, past the marina where boats sat shrink-wrapped against winter like corpses prepared for burial. Her apartment waited in a converted house on the edge of downtown, cheap rent in exchange for thin walls and unreliable heat. She parked on the street, sitting in the car for 5 minutes after killing the engine, watching her breath fog the windshield while her mind tried to process everything that had shifted in the span of 3 hours. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than paper should, its weight pressing against her ribs like a hand reminding her of promises she hadn't made but was now expected to keep. Sleep came in fragments that night, Nina's dreams populated by men in expensive suits, and the sound of doors closing in empty hallways. She woke at 6 to pale sunlight filtering through curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle, her body exhausted but her mind already racing through scenarios and consequences. Saturday meant a double shift, lunch service bleeding into dinner, the weekend crowd always heavier and more demanding than weeknight regulars. She dressed in black pants and a clean white shirt, her uniform simple enough to fade into any background, her appearance designed to be forgotten as soon as the check was paid. The morning air bit at her exposed skin as she walked to her car, frost coating every surface in crystalline patterns that looked like the lake had exhaled across the city overnight. Traffic was light, the streets not yet awake to weekend possibilities, the quietness feeling both peaceful and ominous in ways she couldn't separate. La Casa de Mare looked different in daylight, less mysterious and more mundane, its elegance revealing itself as careful staging rather than inherent beauty. She entered through the back, greeting the prep cooks who were already breaking down vegetables and portioning proteins for the day ahead. The manager ran through the reservation list during the pre-shift meeting, his voice a monotone recitation of times and party sizes that required no response beyond nodding. Nina's section included table 7, Dario's usual spot, though he'd never come for lunch service in the months she'd worked there, his patterns as reliable as tide schedules. Service started at 11:30, families and couples filtering in with the kind of casual comfort that came from not knowing danger when it sat 2 tables away. Nina moved through her routine with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering plates, her performance flawless even while her attention tracked every person who entered through the front door. At 1:15, When the lunch rush had peaked and begun its decline, Dario walked in wearing different clothes but the same careful control. His presence shifted the room's energy exactly as it had the night before. Conversations not stopping, but definitely softening. Awareness rippling outward from his entrance like wind across water. He requested table 7 specifically, though the host would have seated him there anyway, the staff having learned without being told that certain guests had certain expectations. Nina watched from the service station as he settled into the chair facing the window, his movements economical and precise, his attention seeming casual but missing nothing. She approached with menus and water, her heart rate accelerating despite her outward calm, every step closing the distance between her performance of normalcy and the truth neither of them could acknowledge in public. His eyes met hers as she set down the water glass, smoke-gray irises holding recognition that went deeper than customer and server. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to shake through her hands, the words ordinary enough to be meaningless to anyone listening. He nodded once, accepting the menu she offered, his fingers brushing hers for less than a second, but long enough for her to feel the calluses that expensive suits usually concealed. "I'll have the risotto," he said, without opening the menu, his order decided before arrival, his presence here clearly about something other than food. "And tell me, do you work tomorrow evening?" The question sounded casual, curious rather than demanding, but Nina heard the weight beneath it. She thought of her schedule, the shifts marked in pencil on the calendar pinned above her kitchen counter. Sunday evenings usually hers because most servers preferred weekend nights off. "No," she said carefully, aware that truth and lies both carried consequences she couldn't fully calculate. "Tomorrow I'm not scheduled." Something shifted in his expression, a microscopic adjustment that might have been satisfaction or simply acknowledgement of information received. "Good," he said quietly, his gaze returning to the window where lake light reflected off water that had begun to thaw in patches. "Everyone needs time away from work. The world looks different with distance." The words felt layered, meaning stacked beneath meaning like geological formations, and Nina understood she was being told something important wrapped in casual conversation. She nodded, stepping back to put his order in, her mind already working to decode the message while her body maintained the choreography of service. The risotto came out perfectly plated, steam rising from saffron-stained rice arranged with the precision that kept La Casa di Mare's reputation intact. She served it without commentary, refilled his water without being asked, maintained the invisible presence that good service required, while hyper-aware of every breath he took. He ate slowly, methodically, his attention divided between the food and the view outside, occasionally glancing at other diners with the kind of assessment that suggested cataloging rather than curiosity. When he finished, he left cash again. Exact payment this time. No excessive tip to draw attention. Everything calibrated to appear completely normal. But as Nina cleared the table, she found a business card tucked beneath the edge of his plate, face down against white linen. She palmed it smoothly, her movement practiced enough to seem like routine bussing, the card disappearing into her apron before anyone could notice its existence. The card stayed in her apron pocket through the rest of her shift, burning against her hip like a live coal, even though reason said it was just paper and ink. She didn't look at it until her break at 4, stepping into the walk-in cooler where security cameras had blind spots and privacy still existed in stolen moments. The cardstock was thick, expensive, with a single phone number embossed in silver ink that caught the cooler's fluorescent light. No name, no address, no indication of what the number connected to or who might answer if she called, just 10 digits that represented a door she could choose to open or leave closed. She photographed it with her phone, then tucked the physical card back into her apron, the paranoia that had kept her family safe in dangerous neighborhoods, suddenly seeming like wisdom rather than anxiety. The number glowed on her screen, somehow looking more ominous in digital form than it had on expensive paper. Evening service began at 5:30, the dining room filling with different energy than lunch. Couples dressed for dates, business dinners requiring quiet corners, celebrations that came with champagne and desserts. Nina moved through it all with heightened awareness, noticing things she'd previously overlooked in her focus on efficient service. The man stationed near the entrance wasn't quite dressed like a guest, his suit a fraction less expensive, his posture suggesting attention rather than relaxation. He'd appeared sometime after Dario left, taking a position that gave clear views of both entrances, his coffee cup refilled 3 times without him ordering food. Another man sat at the bar, nursing whiskey while watching the dining room in the back bar mirror, his reflection giving him angles on tables his direct gaze couldn't reach. Nina recognized the architecture of surveillance, the pattern of protection, the way Dario had quietly surrounded her workplace with eyes that reported to him. The realization should have frightened her, should have felt like invasion or control, but instead, it settled over her shoulders like the weight of her mother's coat, heavy but warming, constraining but safe. She'd grown up understanding that safety in dangerous neighborhoods came from being claimed by something stronger than the threats around you. By the time her shift ended at 10, she'd counted 4 men who didn't quite fit the pattern of regular guests, their positions creating overlapping fields of observation that covered every approach. They changed throughout the evening, rotating in and out with the smoothness of professional operation, invisible to guests but obvious once you knew what to look for. She left through the back entrance as usual, stepping into cold that had intensified with nightfall, her breath visible in clouds that dissipated slowly in still air. Her car sat exactly where she'd parked it that morning, but something about it looked different, cleaner maybe, or positioned at a slightly different angle, details too small to be certain about but present enough to notice. The drive home took her through streets that seemed more populated than usual with idling vehicles, cars parked in places that gave views of intersections and turns. She told herself it was paranoia, that she was seeing patterns where none existed, but the prickle at the base of her skull suggested otherwise. Her apartment building looked unchanged, its familiar shabbiness somehow comforting after a day of hypervigilance and coded conversations. She parked and locked the Honda, checking the back seat twice before getting out, habits her father had taught her when she was young enough to think he was being overprotective rather than realistic. The stairs to her second-floor unit creaked in familiar patterns, the sounds of neighbors filtering through thin walls, television noise, someone's cooking, the couple downstairs arguing about money and voices that carried more exhaustion than anger. She unlocked her door, stepping into the small space that contained everything she owned in the world. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, but Nina went through it anyway, checking closets and behind shower curtains, verifying windows were locked from the inside. The ritual felt excessive until she remembered the men watching La Casa di Mare, the business card in her pocket, the letter telling her to stay careful as though careful was something she could choose to be. She made tea she didn't drink, sitting at her small kitchen table while night pressed against windows that overlooked an alley and the back of another building. The phone number on her screen seemed to pulse with possibility and threat, 10 digits that represented a conversation she wasn't ready to have, but knew was inevitable. Outside, a car idled at the end of her block, visible through the gap in her curtains, its engine running while exhaust created clouds in the frozen air. She watched it for 20 minutes, trying to decide if it was protection or surveillance, if the distinction even mattered at this point. The card and the letter sat on the table in front of her, physical evidence of a world she'd touched but didn't belong to, artifacts from a story she was still trying to understand. Nina Calvert, who'd grown up learning to be invisible, who'd perfected the art of seeing without being seen, had somehow become visible to people who existed in shadows deeper than any she'd known. The tea grew cold while she sat there, watching the car, watching her building, understanding with certainty that tomorrow evening, when she wasn't scheduled to work, when distance was supposed to give her perspective, she would call that number, not because she wanted to, but because silence was a language she'd already started speaking with Dario Ventrell, and conversations that began in red ink didn't end with simple thank you notes delivered in darkness. Sunday evening arrived wrapped in the kind of silence that makes decisions feel heavier than they should, the city outside Nina's window moving through its weekend rituals, while she sat with her phone and a number she'd memorized without meaning to. She'd spent the day cleaning her apartment, doing laundry, performing tasks that required no thought while her mind circled the inevitable conversation waiting in those 10 silver digits. At 7 o'clock, when the sun had disappeared behind buildings and streetlights flickered to life in patterns that looked like breathing, she finally pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before connecting to a voice that wasn't Dario's, male, neutral, professional in the way that suggested training rather than personality. "Miss Calvert," the voice said without asking who was calling, confirmation that her number had been expected, catalogued, prepared for. "There's a car waiting downstairs. The driver knows where to go." The line went dead before she could respond, before she could ask questions or change her mind, the efficiency of it somehow more unsettling than threat. She looked out her window and saw it immediately, a black sedan idling at the curb where the watching car had been the night before, its engine running, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever waited inside. Her hands shook as she pulled on her coat, checking her reflection in the bathroom mirror like she was preparing for a date, instead of walking into consequences she couldn't predict. The driver stepped out as she approached, opening the back door with the kind of practiced courtesy that came from years of service. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and eyes that had seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything, his silence feeling respectful rather than hostile as she slid into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent. They drove north along the lake, away from downtown's familiar grid into neighborhoods where houses sat behind gates and trees, where money bought distance from the world Nina knew. She watched the city transform through tinted windows, each mile taking her further from the life she'd constructed through careful invisibility. The car turned onto a private road marked only by a number on a stone pillar, trees closing in on both sides until they opened into a clearing where a house sat overlooking the water. Not a mansion exactly, but substantial. Modern architecture softened by natural materials, glass and wood working together to create something that felt both fortress and home. Dario stood on the front steps, wearing dark jeans and a sweater that made him look younger than the suit suggested, more human somehow without the armor of formal dress. The driver opened her door, and she stepped out into cold that smelled of pine and frozen earth, her breath visible between them as she climbed the stairs to where he waited. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same controlled warmth as the night he'd read her warning, the formality of his words at odds with the intimacy of this setting. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door where golden light spilled out into darkness, an invitation that felt more significant than simply entering a house. The interior matched the exterior's aesthetic: clean lines, comfortable furniture, art on walls that suggested actual taste rather than decorator choices. A fire burned in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, its warmth immediately noticeable after the cold outside, its light casting shadows that danced across hardwood floors. "Would you like something to drink?" Dario asked, moving toward a kitchen visible through an archway. His movements relaxed in ways she'd never seen at the restaurant. She nodded, not trusting her voice yet, watching as he poured wine into glasses with the same precision he brought to everything, measuring rather than guessing. He handed her the glass, their fingers brushing again as they had over the menu, and gestured toward chairs positioned near the fire. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds coming from crackling wood and the distant presence of the lake beyond windows that reflected their images back at themselves. "You saved my life," Dario said finally, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than her face, the directness of the statement somehow made easier by not looking at each other. "And in doing so, you made yourself visible to people who notice things. I wanted you to understand what that means before it becomes something you can't control." Nina took a sip of wine that tasted expensive in ways she couldn't articulate, the warmth spreading through her chest, doing nothing to ease the tension coiling in her stomach. She'd expected many things from this conversation, but honest explanation hadn't been among them, the vulnerability in Dario's voice contradicting everything she thought she knew about men who commanded rooms through presence alone. "The man at table 12 works for the Kovac family," Dario continued, his attention still on flames that transformed wood into ash and heat. "They've been testing boundaries for months, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. Your warning prevented what would have been the opening move in something much larger than one failed assassination." The words settled over her like snow accumulating on branches, each sentence adding weight until the full structure became clear. She hadn't just saved one man. She'd altered the trajectory of conflicts she didn't understand, shifted balances maintained through violence and threat, inserted herself into machinery that crushed people who got caught in its gears. "They know someone warned me," he said, finally turning to look at her directly, his smoke-gray eyes reflecting firelight in ways that made them seem warmer than usual. "They don't know who yet, but they're looking. That's why you've noticed the watchers at the restaurant, the cars on your street. Protection isn't optional anymore. It's necessary." Nina's wine glass trembled in her hand, liquid threatening to spill as the reality of her situation crystallized into something she could no longer deny or minimize. She'd thought saving Dario was a single act, a moment of instinct that would pass like weather, but instead it had been a doorway she'd walked through without understanding that doors sometimes only opened one direction. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly, her voice carrying more resignation than anger, the truth of it sitting heavy in her chest. Dario nodded, setting his own glass down on the table between their chairs, his expression holding something that might have been regret or simply recognition of consequences neither of them had chosen. but both had to navigate. "No one ever does," he replied, his words carrying the weight of experience earned through years she couldn't see but could sense in the way he spoke. "But intentions matter less than actions in the world we're both part of now. You acted, and that action has a price. I'm here to make sure you don't pay it alone." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney in brief constellations that died as quickly as they were born. Nina watched them disappear, thinking about all the ways survival required adaptation, how her life had already changed in the 3 days since she'd written those red lines, how the distance back to who she was before seemed to grow with every breath. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing more than she could articulate. What happens to her job, her safety, her carefully constructed anonymity, her future that had seemed so clear before Friday night, turned it into something uncertain and dangerous, and irrevocably altered by 3 sentences she couldn't take back. Dario leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his posture suggesting consideration rather than command, as though her question deserved thought instead of predetermined answers. "Now, you learn what it means to be seen by people like me," he said carefully, each word chosen with precision that suggested he'd been thinking about this conversation since he'd read her warning. "And I teach you how to survive in that visibility." The implications stretched out before her like a road disappearing into fog, the destination unclear but the direction inevitable. She could refuse, walk away, pretend this conversation never happened, but they both knew that was illusion, that safety only came from moving forward into the protection he offered, rather than backward into exposure she could no longer afford. "The Kovacs will eventually trace the warning back to someone at the restaurant," Dario continued, his voice dropping lower as though the walls themselves might be listening, carrying threat closer to them than outside could reach. "When they do, I need you somewhere they can't touch you, somewhere that makes it clear you're under protection. They can't challenge without consequences they're not ready to face." Nina understood what he was offering, and what it would cost. Not money, but autonomy. The freedom to be invisible she'd spent her whole life cultivating. Protection meant belonging to something larger than herself, meant being claimed in ways that would redefine every relationship she had, meant accepting that the person she'd been died the moment she picked up that red pen. "How long?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself even through fear, needing to understand the architecture of this arrangement even if she couldn't refuse it. Dario's expression shifted into something that might have been admiration, or simply recognition of someone who understood that survival required details, clarity about terms when everything else remained uncertain. "Until it's safe," Dario said, which they both knew might mean weeks or months or a lifetime, depending on how conflicts resolved themselves in worlds where safety was negotiated through force rather than law. "I have a property in Montreal, quiet, secure, far enough from Burlington that the Kovacs won't look there immediately. You'd have time to think, to learn, to decide what comes next." The offer hung between them like a bridge extending over water too deep to measure, requiring a leap of faith Nina wasn't sure she possessed. But the alternative, staying in her apartment, continuing at the restaurant, pretending normalcy while danger circled closer, felt less like courage, and more like the kind of denial that got people killed in neighborhoods where she'd learned survival before she learned multiplication. "I need to think about it," she said, though they both understood thinking was just delay, that the decision had already been made the moment she wrote that warning, that everything since had been momentum carrying her toward this conversation, this offer, this transformation from invisible server to someone whose choices mattered enough to protect. Dario nodded, standing with the fluid grace that never left him even in casual clothes, even in his own home where performance shouldn't be necessary. He crossed to a desk near the window, returning with a folder that he placed on the table beside her still full wine glass, its contents representing logistics of disappearance she hadn't yet agreed to, but would probably need. "Everything you'd need is in there," he said, resuming his seat, but maintaining distance that felt respectful rather than cold, giving her space while offering structure. "New identification, bank accounts, contacts in Montreal, just in case you decide thinking is overrated and survival is more important." The hint of humor in his voice surprised her, reminding her that men who controlled violence weren't always violent themselves. She picked up the folder, its weight substantial enough to feel real, its existence proof that Dario had been planning this longer than the phone call, longer than the business card, possibly since the moment he'd read her warning, and understood what it meant that a waitress had seen what trained killers tried to hide. The thoroughness should have frightened her, but instead it felt like someone had finally acknowledged the gravity of what she'd done. "There's something else," Dario said, his voice shifting into a register she hadn't heard before. Softer without being weak, personal without being intimate. "You acted when you didn't have to, when staying silent would have been safer. That kind of instinct is rare, and in my world, rare things become valuable. I wanted you to know that this isn't just about keeping you safe. It's about recognizing what you are." The words settled into spaces inside her she hadn't known were empty, filling them with something that felt dangerously like purpose. She'd spent 21 years being ordinary, invisible, forgettable, and in one night had become someone worth protecting, worth investing in, worth the kind of attention that men like Dario normally reserved for assets rather than people. "What am I?" she asked, needing to hear him name it, to put language to the transformation that had already occurred beneath her awareness, to understand what she'd become in the space between writing the warning and sitting in this chair by this fire drinking wine that cost more than her weekly paycheck. Dario met her eyes across the distance between their chairs, firelight playing across his features in ways that made him look both older and younger simultaneously, wisdom and youth coexisting in the same expression. "Someone who sees," he said simply, the two words carrying weight that entire sentences couldn't match. "And in a world built on blindness, that makes you dangerous. To them and to me. But I'd rather have dangerous with me than against me." The fire crackled its agreement, sparks ascending toward a chimney that led to sky and stars, and a lake frozen at its edges while water still moved beneath ice that looked solid but wasn't, appearance and reality existing in layers that required knowing which surface to trust. Nina thought about her apartment, her job, her careful life built on foundations of invisibility, and realized those foundations had been illusion all along. She stood, folder in hand, the weight of it representing futures she hadn't imagined and couldn't fully picture but knew were more honest than pretending Friday night hadn't changed everything. Dario rose with her, walking her back toward the entrance where the driver waited to return her to a life that was already becoming past tense, momentum carrying her forward into whatever came next. At the door, before stepping back into cold that would carry her home one final time, Nina turned to look at him, this man whose life she'd saved, who was now saving hers in return, who'd shown her that protection could look like imprisonment, but feel like the first honest thing she'd ever been offered. "Thank you," she said, the words insufficient but all she had, gratitude and fear mixing into something that tasted like the beginning of understanding. Dario's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a crack in the control that suggested he understood what those two words cost someone who'd spent her life owing nothing to anyone. "Thank you," he replied, his voice carrying layers of meaning that referenced menus and red ink and instincts that saved lives, for seeing when everyone else was blind. "Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support matters and helps me continue bringing you stories like Nina and Dario's, tales of survival, protection, and the dangerous connections that form when silence becomes its own language. I'll see you in the next one.